It's something we take for granted in Canada, access to fresh drinking water at the turn of a tap. But believe it or not, there are some communities in our country that are still without it. Case in point, Shoal Lake number 40, an Ontario First Nation that has had to boil its water for the past 18 years. As Lorraine McNabb discovered, it's only one of many communities without the basic necessities because of an outdated government plan.
Shoal Lake number 40 First Nation used to sit along one of the main canoe routes, the Trans-Canada before the Trans-Canada. A trading hub where voyageurs came to trade furs with the Ojibwe people of Shoal Lake. It's hard to imagine today that Shoal Lake number 40, a First Nation about 200 kilometers east of Winnipeg, is cut off from the world, forced into isolation. It all starts on this strip of land that was built by outsiders who came to take the water.
Where we're standing right now is a man-made dike, or we can call it a man-made dam.
If you visit the First Nations community of Shoal Lake number 40, Stuart Red Sky is likely to show you around.
We're standing right here.
Show you what happened to his land, his people.
The dike was made back in the 1900s for the water supply for Winnipeg, the city of Winnipeg and its citizens. When that happened, we were basically relocated, forced into a man-made island. To this day, the situation has not changed. We're still on a forced, isolated, man-made island.
The community of about 250 people here at Shoal Lake number 40 is cut off on all sides, surrounded by water.
So what we're going to do is we're going to go all the way around.
This man-made canal is where Shoal Lake number 40 First Nations problems began 100 years ago. It was where the community was severed from the mainland, created to divert dirty water down into the reserve and away from the pristine waters drawn into an aqueduct bound for Winnipeg.
We certainly were not involved in any kind of negotiations. It was more or less just take without asking.
This is Shoal Lake number 40's chief, Irwin Red Sky. He says his community's problems began 100 years ago when the city of Winnipeg came to take the water.
The city of Winnipeg was growing at the time. It was becoming the Chicago of the North, and they decided to look for water elsewhere because it was growing rapidly. And unfortunately, they looked to the east here, 100 miles east, where Shoal Lake has pristine water and 350 feet higher in elevation, so they thought they can just take the water from here.
The water from this lake was taken for the city of Winnipeg. The Indigenous people of Shoal Lake say they didn't even give their consent. That water still feeds the citizens of Winnipeg today with fresh, clean water to drink.
That cement area where the rails are over and above it, is exactly where the water pipe is that goes to Winnipeg.
In the early 1900s, Winnipeg had a problem. It was drawing its water from the Assiniboine and Red Rivers, but outbreaks of typhoid fever sent them looking for another source of clean, fresh water. The irony is that here at Shoal Lake number 40, they haven't had access to clean drinking water in nearly 2 decades.
We did everything around our backs in terms of getting their necessary approvals.
The Canadian government expropriated nearly 3,400 acres of reserve land to the city of Winnipeg to build its aqueduct, without the consent of the people who lived there.
Their engineering study said that with the exception of a few Indian, it's uninhabited. So they took that as a right, I guess, to take whatever they needed.
Approvals for the aqueduct project went all the way to Washington, D.C., to the International Joint Commission, which oversees water shared by Canada and the U.S. The people living on the land say the only notice they had was this tiny ad, published in the local newspaper, The hearings went forward without Shoal Lake at the table, and the aqueduct project was greenlit.
We still live the consequence of that decision to this day, 100 years later.
100 years later, here are some of the consequences. Crumbling, overcrowded houses. Buildings in need of repairs, like this primary school or the band office. There's no road access, so garbage piles up. So does sewage underground. It leaks into the water supply. So it's no surprise that Shoal Lake Number 40 has no access to what the United Nations considers a basic human right: clean drinking water. Shoal Lake Number 40 has been on a boil water advisory for nearly 2 decades. There's a generation of children who have never known anything else.
My name is Ainsley Red Sky, and I'm a junior council.
I'm Trina Red Sky, and I'm a junior chief.
Ainsley and Trina describe a scenario most Canadian kids could never even dream of. They can't drink the water from their own tap at home. It's filled with bacteria and parasites that can make people very ill.
Well, it's kind of hard.
Yeah, because like sometimes they wouldn't drop jugs off for us, and because there's lots of us in our family, and we go through a lot of water all the time. Usually they keep the water jugs over there in the arena.
The water used to be stored here until the floor rotted and caved in.
It became to a point where I couldn't hold our water jugs anymore, our bottled water.
So the bottled water supply got shuffled over here to the youth center.
And you're about to see our water department. Winnipeg, they have a state-of-the-art water treatment plant, you know. This is normally a youth center. A lot of children that are 18 years old or younger don't know nothing other than boil water advisory.
The cost of bottled water for Shoal Lake Number 40 is $75,000 per year. But that's just the cost of the water itself. Transporting it, storing it, distributing it, that's all extra.
All our discretionary funds are going towards access costs. You know, that should not be. We should be building houses and improving our education system.
To make things right, the chief is trying to build an all-weather access road connecting Shoal Lake Number 40 directly to the Trans-Canada Highway. No more ferry, no more treacherous ice roads. The place marker he's erected says it all.
There's never enough funds to fix everything, but I understand that. But you give us some infrastructure like this road that we desperately need to be self-sufficient, so we don't depend on government handouts and be self-sustaining community. We always were, and we have it, you know, we can be again.
They've started to build Freedom Road with what money they have, but there are obstacles beyond the 25 kilometers of forest they'll need to clear. They still need $10 million from the federal government. Tomorrow, there will be an announcement here at Shoal Lake that could change everything. Trina and Ainsley have high hopes.
I hope they say there is going to be a road, because everyone would be so happy and stuff like that. And no more struggling for people who don't have cars and stuff like that. Everyone would just be excited for it. I would. I hope there will be a road being built. The Freedom Road.
Next,
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a very troubled man today.
holding out hope for government help.
Are you committed in principle to seeing the road constructed?
It's a big morning for Shoal Lake No. 40 First Nation. Delegates from the City of Winnipeg, Province of Manitoba, and federal government are here to talk about infrastructure.
Are you committed in principle to seeing the road constructed?
Today, the community here will find out whether they'll get the final $10 million they need to build an all-weather access road, a lifeline to things like clean drinking water and economic opportunity. And if it doesn't, the children of Shoal Lake No. 40 will be ready with their homemade protest signs. See, the situation isn't simple. The feds and Ontario government want to add another lane to the Trans-Canada Highway. But since it's on First Nations land, they need Shoal Lake No. 40's permission. And Shoal Lake No. 40 wants something in return. A road for a road. The community and the politicians seem to be on edge. The outcome of today is anyone's guess.
The community now has opportunity.
First up, Warren White, Grand Chief of Grand Council Treaty 3, to which Shoal Lake No. 40 belongs. He sets the tone for today's announcements with a firm reminder about honoring the treaties.
I want to make sure the Canadian public knows and the Government of Canada knows that if it wasn't for Treaty 3 and the strong leadership and the spiritual traditional values that we hold, there would be no Canada, but we agreed to treaty signing, and we have upheld our treaty. We've never ended our end of the bargain. We've always practiced it, we live it. As long as the sun shines, as long as the river flows, that means forever.
But members of Shoal Lake say that treaty was broken 100 years ago by the Canadian government. The community is anxious, waiting to hear if the federal government will pledge $10 million to build Freedom Road. Conservative MP Greg Rickford takes the stage.
I'm pleased to be representing the Government of Canada, and in particular my colleague Minister Valcourt, Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, to announce that the Government of Canada will invest $1 million in support of the design, not the study, not the proposal, but the technical design of the Freedom Road. This is funding that's made possible from the government's Economic Action Plan and a commitment to support community infrastructure.
$1 million for a design study, but it's not anywhere close to the $10 million the community needs to build their road. The people here want answers.
They've said that they are committed in principle.
Greg Rickford slips away with nothing more to say. But there's someone else here that is compelled to speak.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am a very troubled man today. For 100 years, Shoal Lake No. 40 First Nation has had to pay so Winnipeg could get fresh water.
Now, on this day, with this disappointing news, the people of Shoal Lake No. 40 have reached the limits of patience, like this mother, Roxanne Green.
We don't have clean water, but yet we're the supplier of clean drinking water to the city of Winnipeg. We live in Canada. Most people have clean drinking water. Most people can come home freely whenever they want and leave when they want. Those are human rights. Our human rights are being violated right here.
No reliable road access means no clean water.
Basic rights like water we don't have. These little ones, they know nothing but jug water, bottled water.
The possibilities are endless once we have that road. But right now, without a road, the excuse of why they don't want to build us a treatment plant is because there's no access for things to get here.
Without basic infrastructure like safe road access and clean drinking water, the First Nations people of Shoal Lake No. 40 worry about the future of the youngest members of the community.
Our children can
Eureka! Come here, girl. These kids, every kid up there, every human being in this man-made island.
Until things change here, life goes on status quo. No clean drinking water and no easy, safe way to get on and off reserve.
It's embarrassing to call yourself a Canadian when these things are happening right here.
Next.
And you will understand that I am the Deputy Minister that helped implement this cap, something I'm ashamed to have been part of.
Reneging on a deal again.
All of our communities live next to water, on or next to waterways. This is how our communities were formed. This is how we traveled. So it's built into First Nations beliefs that water is, precious. There's a spiritual value to it. We respect it, we honor it. It's a basic requirement of life. And water is the lifeblood. We hold that women, hold the water of life when a child is born.
But for many First Nations communities across Canada, the relationship to water has become tenuous. As of January 2015, 126 First Nations communities had drinking water advisories. That accounts for 20% of all First Nations in Canada. An estimated 20,000, or 1 in 16 First Nations people living on reserves, are without access to running water or sewage treatment.
Without the funding in place, we're putting First Nations in jeopardy.
Bringing First Nations water infrastructure up to standard with the rest of Canada, building things like water treatment plants, would cost an estimated $4.7 billion over 10 years. Irving LeBlanc is Special Advisor on Infrastructure for the Assembly of First Nations.
I don't think it's too simplistic to say that that's about $470 million a year, and we're only getting $165 million.
$165 million a year might sound like a big number, but it's less than half the money required for the water infrastructure needed by First Nations. And that's just the shortfall for water infrastructure. It's even worse if you include the shortfall for all infrastructure on reserves. Here's why and where that shortfall began.
And you will understand that I am the Deputy Minister that helped implement this cap, something I'm ashamed to have been part of.
Scott Serson used to be Deputy Minister for Indian Affairs, the department responsible for First Nations communities. In February, he delivered an emotional speech, a kind of mea culpa.
Provincial governments have been treated entirely differently than First Nations governments since 2004.
Here's what happened. Back in 1998, Serson was part of a government plan to restrict spending to help pull Canada out of its recession. For his department, that meant a 2% cap on First Nations infrastructure spending. This was meant to be temporary.
18 years later, First Nations have every reason to believe they were misled. How can we expect them to believe anything they are told by government while the 2% cap continues?
This is an eagle's feather presented to me by National Chief Phil Fontaine.
Serson is now long retired, but continues to volunteer and consult on First Nations issues.
For me, it was always about making a better country. And this particular issue, some have said, recently, that this is the most important social issue facing our country.
From his home in Ottawa, Serson revealed to 16 by 9 why he ended up in front of that Senate committee in February. He recalls the original meeting with First Nations in 1998 and what he proposed to them.
If you cooperate with us, when the deficit is defeated, we will establish a new and fair rate of growth. That was the commitment we made.
But in 2004, when the recession lifted and the government started to reinvest in the provinces, it didn't reinvest in First Nations infrastructure as promised. Instead, it kept the 2% spending cap in place.
The failure to honor that commitment made me feel a part of that negative history of lack of following up on commitments by the Government of Canada.
Canada ranks between 6th and 8th on the United Nations Human Development Index. But if you apply the same indices to First Nations people, we fall anywhere between 63rd and 78th. That's a huge gap.
National Chief Perry Bellegarde recently launched a campaign called Closing the Gap.
That means removal of the 2% cap that's been out to our communities for 20 years, which was only supposed to be a temporary measure that has not kept up with inflation, that has not kept up the rising population in our territories. So there's a call for a new fiscal framework.
16 by 9 requested an interview with Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada, the department in charge of First Nations infrastructure spending, to find out if there were plans to remove the 2% funding cap. It turned down our interview request, but did provide a statement. The 2% increase is not a cap per se, but rather an escalator for inflation and population growth, which guarantees a minimum rate of increase in spending on Aboriginal core services. Additional funding in successive budgets to support Aboriginal people has been provided beyond the 2%. Irving LeBlanc says the government's response doesn't explain why First Nations people are living without access to basic necessities like clean water, and that the National Chief is right about the funding shortfall.
So that's the gap that he's trying to address, making sure that First Nations, live and their quality of life matches that of other Canadians, that other Canadians have become and take for granted to live like that.
Back at Shoal Lake No. 40 First Nation, Trina and Ainsley Red Sky continue to live under a boil water advisory, still hoping that one day the urgency of their situation will be recognized and addressed.
This has been ignored for far too long, and the consequence is an impact on the life chances of First Nations children.
The people of Shoal Lake No. 40 remain hopeful. Just prior to the federal election, Justin Trudeau said that if elected, his government would commit $10 million to the Freedom Road project and would lift the 2% cap. We'll be right back. That is our broadcast for tonight. A reminder, you can always connect with us on Facebook and Twitter or at global16by9.com. I'm Carolyn Jarvis. From all of us here at 16 by 9, thanks for watching.